Okay, I think it's time to start this panel conversation on this very, very important topic. Sexual and reproductive health and rights are under attack in the world. And how can we mobilize forces together as different actors from the UN, from SIDA, from civil society organizations, and from religious actors? So we are going to have a very important conversation around that topic right now. And I have a very distinguished group of panelists here together with me up here on the podium, and I will introduce them to you. After that, I will just set the scene for this conversation, and then we will engage ourselves on the topic. First, on my left-hand side, I have Victoria Petitjean, who's the program manager for the Global Interfaith Network for people of all sexes, sexual orientation, gender identities and expressions. And the acronym is GINSOGI. So you are very much welcome, Victoria. Then we have Anna-Karin Johansson, Secretary General of the RFSU, and it's the RFSU and ACT Church of Sweden that jointly organize these panel conversations. And you are also very welcome, Anna-Karin, and you have a great experience in this field, and you used to be the former General Secretary of the Swedish Afghanistan Committee as well, so you have a great deal of experience also in other fields. Björn Andersson, you're the Regional Director in Asia and the Pacific of the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, UNFPA, and you have more than 25 years of experience in development cooperation. You're also very much welcome.
Thank you.
And then we have Karin Jämtin, the Director General for SIDA, Swedish International Development Authority. And Karin, you have already taken part in a big number of seminars here at Sverige ett Världen, and you're used to talking about all kinds of issues. But this one is an important one for you as well. And finally, we have, and we are very pleased to have Heather Grant, the Canadian Ambassador to Sweden, with a diverse background in foreign affairs. And you've been focusing on international trade, and you've been the negotiator on a number of agreements, and you were for a period also with a permanent mission to the World Trade Organization. But here we're going to talk about social and reproductive health and rights. I will just set the scene as an introduction, and then I will come back to you with a number of questions. We have a situation where we have a conservative backlash and shrinking civic space for actors working on SRHR, sexual and reproductive health and rights around the world. And that is not only among secular organizations, but also religious organizations that do engage on this issue. And this growing backlash has, of course, many deep-seated drivers, which is partly linked to the authoritarian turn that we see in the world, the rise of authoritarian and populist governments in many countries, which has also been difficult for all the activists and organizations working on SRHR issues. In this context, organizations working on issues that are legally and socially sensitive and restricted, such as women's rights and LGBTIQ rights, working on abortion, comprehensive sexuality education, do face additional threats of social exclusion, imprisonment, physical violence, or even murder. And it has also become increasingly difficult to raise and discuss women's sexual and reproductive rights in the UN, at the UN, and indeed to talk about gender equality, also at the high-level UN events. Religious actors play a key role in shaping people's values, norms of acceptable behavior and life roles. And it's true that churches and faith communities have throughout history used theology to uphold and create discriminating structures and stereotyped gender roles. However, there are also many churches and faith communities that do promote gender justice and SRHR. So it's essential to engage with a diversity of religious perspectives in these discussions to avoid a simplified narrative on the role of religious actors in this field. And we're going to focus here in this conversation, how can we mobilize innovative partnerships between faith, secular and other organizations, and what kind of methods can we identify in building these alliances together? So, with that introduction, we will start the conversation here together with our panelists. Considering your different roles and experiences and insights into this issue, what do you see are the necessary strategies for us to counteract the current backlash on SRHR, sexual reproductive health and rights, in terms of the shrinking space that we see around the world? And I will ask each one of you to give a comment to that question. And we'll start with Victoria.
Sure, thank you. So as you mentioned, I work for the Global Interfaith Network, which is a global South-centered global organization working at the intersection of faith and LGBTI rights. One of our programs focuses on UN advocacy. And what we hear a lot in the UN space, as you've said, is that LGBTQI rights are a Western import and a neo-colonial agenda. So what we feel is essential to focus on is to deconstruct that dominant rhetoric at the UN. And so doing capacity and training of speakers, LGBTI leaders of faith coming from a global South context, and to come into a space like the UN and talk about their experience of faith and what traditional values are to them, what religion is to them, and to show that reconciliation between faith and sexual orientation as a very regionally grounded reality and not something coming from the West. We find it essential to bring forward these new voices coming from the Global South in this space, and working also with Global North delegations at the UN to support us in bringing these new voices to take up that space and to counter that anti-rights rhetoric we're increasingly hearing in that space. It's also essential to adopt an intersectional approach. So we work not just with LGBTQI organizations, but also children's rights organizations, disability rights organizations, elderly persons, and together to create these connections and to create a strong network to be strengthened in a space like the UN. I want to do one last note. I know my minute is up, but what we're generally observing as well is that these anti-rights groups are increasingly dominant in all of, at the UN in New York, in Geneva, in the different agencies, and they're adopting really strong strategies. They have a huge amount of resources compared to other NGOs, human rights NGOs. And I think we really need to be maybe a little bit more revolutionary in our approach and to really realize that the human rights system is being undermined from within. And this is not a minority, this is not a small issue, this is really becoming more and more dominant. We're seeing it more and more at every Human Rights Council session, every Commission on Status of Women. And I think we really need to step up our game and work more and more with delegations, with funders, with Global North, Global South delegations to really be strong against this anti-rights movement.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And we can come back to that, how we build alliances across sectors. And Anna-Karin, please.
Yeah, I can kind of take it on from that. And I think we have to realize that what is happening now is not a backlash that is kind of just happening. It's very strong forces that are trying to change the agenda. And they are cooperating, they are funding each other, they are finding joint strategies. And I think we as a community who wants to push SRHR issues also need to be much more stronger in our joint strategies and in our cooperation. I know that Sweden is one of the few donors that today support organizations that work for the most controversial issues. And I think that is very, very good and could be continued. There are some more other countries that do this. That is also needed. And I think that needs to be continued. The question is, how can Sweden kind of join together with other countries and find ways both in the area of the more common issues and the very, very controversial issues. Another area where I also think that we need to kind of talk much more openly and find joint solutions is the shrinking space. We know it's there, and it's shrinking all the time. And we made interviews with our partners around the world around this, and one of them asked, why doesn't the donors try to find joint strategies and put pressure on countries if they close the space too much? And here I think that donors can be much more clear and have joint strategies in that area. I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Anna-Karin. And this is a topic that we've been debating in a number of seminars, so we can come back to that. And I guess Karin is quite used to it as well, so you may have sort of something to chip in on this. But before that, we will listen to Björn. Yes.
Thank you, Eric, and good morning, everybody. I've spent a couple of years now as regional director in the Asia-Pacific region. And when I travel to countries in the region and when I meet our major donors, Sweden and Canada, among others, there are three things that I highlight, which all have a bearing on sexual and reproductive health and right. The first one is the underpinning all of this is gender equality and women's empowerment. And that is really threatened by so many different forces all over the world, even though we have made great progress in many ways. And I think the great progress that we're doing in countries that's also the fuel, if you like, for the pushback. So, we need to be able to manage that kind of way forward. But the other one is a broader agenda of human rights. Without internalizing or without people having the ability to enjoy the human rights, we will never reach the furthest behind. We will never reach ethnic minorities, LGBTIQ persons all over the world. So those two are really, really important to discuss. But I'm also the first one to say that you can't come to a government or perhaps conservative environments to start up talking about human rights up front. You have to be strategic. You have to find the ways that you build the trust through, for example, using the principles of transparency and participation, and find those things which really makes it much more easier to reach, especially men, because that's usually the case in many countries, especially in more conservative countries. But the second part is really to continue building the movement. It's 25 years since we have had the ICPD, the International Conference on Population and Development, and the Program of Action, which was endorsed and adopted in Cairo in 1994. And what was so successful at that time, yes, we had a different kind of political environment, but it was also that academia, government, civil society organizations, faith-based organizations, women's groups came together and realized that the old way to look at population and development wasn't working any longer. That we needed to look at the individual woman and the individual man and to be able to enable them to decide freely on how they wanted to, how many children they wanted to have, when they wanted to have the children, and if, exactly. So that movement is something that I hope that we can replicate as we're moving forward now. And I think that comes back to what you're saying, that we need to find ways of working together so that we can see how our different comparative advantages, if you like, can really make this leap forward. And the third part, which I think is so important, maybe it's evident, but we can never take progress for granted. We can never, just because you're allowing, for example, abortion, if you're allowing same-sex marriage, that can change overnight. And that's the same with access to family planning, it's access to reproductive health services. And we see that in so many different countries, that overnight you have changes in laws, or you have movements in countries which are step by step changing the situation. And all of a sudden you realize, oh, something happened here and you don't have the same freedom. So those three ingredients, it's something that I argue very clearly within UNFPA in my region, that working with gender equality, human rights, building a movement, and also to never take human rights gains for granted, absolutely key.
Have to be vigilant all
exactly.
the time.
Absolutely.
Karin? Please.
There are so many things to say, so many good things or important things have been mentioned, but I would like to start to remind us all that this is not a new issue. It's not a new issue in the sense that it's 25 years since 1994, but it's also not a new issue in the sense that some 15, 20 years ago, we had another American president that had installed another MCP at the time, not as severe as today, and the backlash was not as heavy or as severe as today, but still we fought the same fight at that time. Meaning that we can also learn from history and how we worked at that time, how we built the coalitions, and how we opposed that situation and tried to change that situation in different ways. There are some, I would just like to mention, I think, 4 different things, and that is that we have to mobilize all of the, I've written, good parts of society, meaning all of the actors that you have mentioned, the civil society organizations, state institutions, good change agents within governments that are maybe negative on a broad sense, on a macro sense. But one actor that has not been mentioned is business, actually. We also have to bring them into this. So all parts of society have to be mobilized to meet this backlash. We have to always recognize that it's a rights issue. And we always have to remember that rights issues are difficult. Not because of its sometimes vagueness and that we can debate what is this right really around, but it's difficult because it's always around changing of power relations. It's around giving the rights and the power to people with very little or no rights or no power to begin with. Therefore, the sensitivity of the issue. But I think that we should also actually use the economic argument. It's good for society with living up to the sexual and reproductive health and rights standards. It's economically sound for a society to do that. We should, of course, base all of this in the rights agenda, on the rights agenda, but never forget the economic argument. It's also an important argument. So working with all kinds of actors, building coalitions, always remembering and working from a rights perspective around this, always recognizing the difficulty in this because it's around power, changing power relations, but also use the economic argument. It's a smart argument and it can be used.
That is, yeah, absolutely. And to include business as well, as you said,
yeah.
New actors on the field. Please, Heather.
Thanks, Eric.
From a Canadian perspective and perhaps a global perspective as well.
Well, first, thank you for allowing me to join this panel, which is, of course, a very important topic and one that we're very focused on. I thought I would just start my remarks by providing just a little bit of context where we come from as the Government of Canada. And the first is that we share the view that the empowerment of women, their full participation in society is fundamental to democratic societies, and that if you involve women and girls' voices and their presence, policies and programs that are developed will actually be to the benefit of everybody in society. So we have been implementing a broad set of feminist policies, both domestically and internationally, and just a few sort of more recent ones. In December, we actually upgraded our agency focused on the status of women to a full ministry, a full department, which is quite a significant change in our system. We've also developed a feminist international assistance policy and a national defense policy that also focuses on trying to engage more women participating in peace building, for example. But if I come specifically to the question, which is, what strategies can be used to meet the current backlash on SRHR and the shrinking civic and democratic space, what I would say here is a key is to build and support the capacity of civil society organizations that are working in this space. Various ways to go about doing this. One of them is to help build alliances and networks so that there's a sharing of best practices among those that are working in the field. And one recent initiative that a number of your organizations were involved in was actually the Women Deliver conference that was held in early June, and it brought together together 8,000 individuals, world leaders, advocates, academics, journalists, all to dialogue, critique, share information, motivate, all about women's and girls' health and well-being. And we understand there were well over 100,000 individuals online as well who are participating in this. And, you know, strong Swedish participation, as we say, but this is so important to get people together to talk, to share, to understand. And this is one way that we felt we might be able to help build support and capacity. But another one has to do with providing predictable and stable funding for women's organizations that advance gender equality in developing country. And this may actually go a little bit to a point that was made earlier. One of our recent initiatives is actually it's the establishment of what's called the Equality Fund. And the Equality Fund was announced at Women Deliver, and it's a consortium of Canadian and international CSOs, and what they're trying to do through predictable and stable funding is to solve the funding gap issues that exist for women's organizations. And a statistic that I had heard and was shocked by is that only 0.5% of all international development assistance actually goes to women's organizations promoting gender equality matters. And it's just so small.
0.5.
0.5%. Yeah, quite extraordinary when you think about it. So this Equality Fund, Canadian government provided some seed money, $300 million, but what it is supposed to leverage donors, private sector, basically to build up to a $1 billion Canadian fund in about 15 years, again, for predictable and stable funding for women's organizations that are operating in gender equality field.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. That's also an inspiring example, whether you're sort of setting an example for other donors. I don't know whether Karin would like to reflect.
We actually have exactly the same, so we can cooperate on this. A year ago, or a year and a half maybe ago, the Swedish government decided on a gender strategy for the development cooperation. And one important goal in that is actually to support women's organization at global level, recognizing exactly the same gap and the need for this. So I look forward to discussing with you how to join forces and really support women's organization.
You're going to find that Canada and Sweden work very, very closely together.
We can talk together.
And we take inspiration from each other,
Exactly.
which is great, and I think such a key element of how we actually work in this area and move forward.
Yeah.
It's finding our like-mindeds and cooperating.
And this is, of course, also to offset the funding shortfall from the US government. So in that sense, it's a much bigger challenge for you, like-minded governments and development authorities these days. Huh? I'm just coming back. Perhaps you would like to comment some of the things that have been said as well. But in terms of what you said, Anna-Karin, you lifted that up as well, Victoria. We need to join hands and we need to strategize together. Perhaps one is a bit surprised that, you said we did that, Björn. You said that 25 years ago. We were very strong together. And then somehow we lost the momentum in terms of collaborative partnerships. Why is that in the first place, before we sort of moving to the current situation?
To explain that, I think you need to go back to the Millennium Development Goals and what happened after the major conferences in the 90s. We made great progress at the time. And then, that culminated in the MDGs. And I remember myself sitting in New York, following member states' negotiations around MDG 5, which was on maternal health. And the effort put in by like-minded member states to get a reference into reproductive health. And we did. But that, for somehow at the time, you said, we made it. And you became complacent, and you don't really see that you need to continuously working on promoting SRHR and also human rights. And that's what I'm meaning, what I meant to say, that we can never be relaxed thinking that just because we have got MDG 5B, as it was named, on reproductive health, or we have gained progress in access to maternal health or family planning services, that we can take that for granted. And you see that if you also, because at the end of the day, people's reproductive health behavior or sexual health behavior, it varies. And look at what happened in the 80s and 90s when we had the HIV/AIDS, culminating, and there was so much information and so much openness about it. So yes, we change things. But today you can see, for example, that sexually transmitted infections are on the increase. And that's partly because we are not doing what we need to do to inform people how they can protect themselves and the responsibilities they have. So I think it is constant opening. But partly, yes, we were too relaxed, I think, because we thought things were moving pretty good. And today the world looks different, partly because of what's happening in the US, but also what's happening in countries, how they see themselves as being in the center of the world.
Victoria would like to comment on that as well.
Yeah. From our perspective, I think maybe we feel the need to broaden our understanding of collaboration. And we feel that sometimes maybe we all work in silos. So within the LGBT movement, historically, there's been huge amounts of opposition to religion. We couldn't even walk into this space and talk about faith because religion was seen as the enemy.
Yeah.
So we've done a lot of work with our partners, secular LGBT organizations, to discuss and to have informal discussions together to create links between individuals so that we could meet together and begin working together after discussions. And that's also the case between Christian groups and Muslim groups. I think we really need an interfaith approach. We're facing an anti-rights movement where you have the OIC, Organization of Islamic States, working with the Orthodox Church, working with the Vatican. So they're also adopting an interfaith approach, and we need to be able to respond to that as well.
Do you feel there's a change here that somehow we also see from the government and from the UN, they are more willing to engage with you as well? Because normally you see some very conservative voices coming from the different faith communities, but now we see a much stronger alliance also of progressive voices on these issues from different faith communities. Do you feel that there is this respect now and that we have a different situation if you compare with 5-10 years ago, perhaps, when you want to stay away from religious organizations working on SRHR issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I've just come from Geneva and the Human Rights Council, and we've just had a side event on religious communities affirming LGBTQI people from around the world. And it's thanks to Canada and to Sweden that we were able to organize this side event in Geneva. And we saw South Africa at the side event. We saw Tunisia for the first time at an LGBTQI faith event. So things are definitely changing, but it takes time, and it takes building relationships, sustainable relationships, and just to keep going.
I'm coming back to what you said, we need to be revolutionary so in terms of solutions, but we will come back to that. Anna-Karin, you also said, I mean, this links up to the whole issue of shrinking space, not only on this issue, but on many other issues. And we really have to see a joint approach from different governments tackling shrinking space. This is something we also saw when we were together in Tanzania, when it was very, very difficult, for instance, to meet with LGBTI communities. It was incredibly difficult because they feared for their lives. Would you like to reflect on that, what you actually said, and how?
I think that is, then we're coming back to what when we talk about rights. We have to see that human rights is very broad, and we cannot work in our different silos when it comes to this shrinking space. We cannot see in our own area, oh, now the space is shrinking here, because it might start shrinking somewhere else. When we talk to our partners around the world, sometimes they say, no, we can still act quite good, but there are others, maybe political actors or journalists, where the space is shrinking dramatically. And we have to be aware and look at different areas to see, because we have to help each other. And that might feel a little bit overwhelming, but when we were in Tanzania, for example, we could see that some actors can still play a very important role. For example, the religious actors, while the LGBTQI actors, they are totally, and they're actually locked off from the rest of the civil society. And this is a big danger, that when we see one group that gets so pushed out of the society, that also the rest of the civil society leave them outside, then it's great danger for them. And I think one of the very good things with this trip that we made together, civil society in Sweden, was that we could see this. We have to be aware of each other's areas. Talking about funding, I think is very important to see that long-term funding is something that is lacking dramatically when it comes to these most pressed out organizations like LGBTQI actors. We try to work with 3 areas: abortion, non-discrimination, and sexual education. Maybe the 3 areas where it's most difficult to work. And we put together organizations within these areas, within each country, to make them see each other and to try to work together. And I think this working together is something that we need to strengthen ourselves. We are experts, but we are also joining each other in a kind of common push towards this backlash.
And it's this general erosion of the human rights framework as well, which is sort of the broader background also.
Definitely.
And the broader setting for this discussion. I know that you have prepared for this panel conversation in terms of also sort of challenging one another. And I will ask Victoria, now you have a chance to address yourself directly to SIDA and to Karin Jämtin. And in terms of what kind of advice would you like to give to SIDA and to Sweden in terms of the revolutionary approach in building alliances and network? Because that's what you said.
Yeah, we were actually talking about it last night, and I said I have the concept in mind. I'm not quite sure how it looks like in practice at the moment, but I appreciated what you said in terms of sustainable funding. I think in civil society we struggle quite a bit with being able. We have a huge agenda. We're trying to bring social justice, inclusion, human dignity, and we're working on short-term project funding. When this takes a really long time, this takes sustainable support, and it's even beyond funding. It's also finding the support, having the support from delegations in very complex, difficult places like the UN. So we're also looking for capacity building and having the support from delegations, from funders, to be able to enter that space, knowing where to go, knowing who to talk to, knowing who to contact and building alliance with. And I don't think civil society can do that by themselves. We need these delegations to be constantly holding our hands and for us to work together and to be in constant dialogue to share what our struggles are, what our challenges are, and how we can move forward. And not during, just the Human Rights Council session or just during the 2 weeks of the Commission on Status of Women, but throughout the year having intersectional dialogue and meetings.
Even more so than what has been the case in the previous years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, to strengthen that. And I just wanted also to jump on what you were saying about funding women's organizations. Coming from an LGBTQI organizations, we really see the need to deconstruct heteronormativity. And when you talk about women's rights, really we need to talk about the health of trans women, the health of intersex people, of lesbian women. This is a totally under-researched, underfunded sector. And it cannot just be on the side. It cannot be just a few projects we fund on the side. It needs to be mainstreamed in women's rights organizations and funding.
Karin, I would like to respond to some of these reflections and observations from Victoria.
I heard 3 things actually in what you said. The one is the need for core funding and long-term funding of CSOs. That's what I heard anyway, where you began. We work a lot with that. We can work more with that, and we can also encourage other donors to work with long-term and core funding. I'm proud that we do it, but we can do it even more. In this core funding, why we do that is, of course, that we see the civil society organizations of all kinds as partners in delivering, but most of all, but also as in delivering policy changes, being present at all kinds of UN situations, in UN organizations or UN meetings or other meetings for that sake. Therefore, in the Swedish delegations to the Financing for Development, there was a civil society organization representative, only one, and therefore it was the Concord representative, but she represented all of you, I was about to say, but anyway. And we also spoke about gender. Unfortunately, not that broad approach approach, as you pointed out in the end, which is of course right. We should include all kinds of groups, whatever part you are, you choose yourself to be recognized as, in our discussions when we talk about gender, rights, etc. So I'll take that with and we'll do it even better. But we always try to include all of these issues in our meetings with different kinds of UN bodies, the UNHCR, the FFD, or whatever. So thank you for that.
And you have a very close cooperation with UNFPA and
Yes.
SIDA, and also a funding relationship. How can you develop that one in terms of also challenging the UNFPA to, I mean, it's already a very important and progressive actor in this arena, but do you have any advice to give to...
I would like to say a couple of things. The one thing is that we must strategize more together, actually. We can push the agenda or move the agenda better when we sort of recognize each other's strengths. You cannot always speak all of your mind, but we can be more open and discuss, because we are only one country. We have a very clear feminist foreign policy to back into when we need support from government. And we also have a long history of working in the field of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So when we sort of divide tasks, we become stronger as a team. To do that, we have to meet more often. And the two important things that we have to do now is to never lose sight of the R in the end. The SRHR. I'm worried sometimes, to be honest, that it sort of slips away from some of the meetings, and so never forget the second R in discussions. And the other thing is to be strong, even stronger in the humanitarian settings. To integrate sexual and reproductive health services with the rights perspective, of course, in humanitarian situations.
That's true. That's also an issue that's been raised by RFSU. And the importance, talking about the humanitarian situation as well, that has to be included. And you had a seminar on that at the beginning of May as well, the importance of that topic. Coming back to you, Björn, in terms of the challenge you've been given, I mean, reflecting on what Heather said about the different actions that is forthcoming from the Canadian government, the Equality Fund, predictable and stable funding, and generally feminist policies, perhaps inspired also, or vice versa, by the Swedish example. What kind of advice do you would like to give to the Canadian government in terms of being even more progressive in this area?
Can I just ask?
Oh, you can also reflect on what Karin said.
Because I fully agree with you, and I think working together with our different mandates, if you like, that's so important. And wherever I come out in Asia Pacific region, I make a case to meet Swedish ambassadors, and they always open up their arms, saying that we might not be able to give you other resources or earmarked resources. Because Sweden doesn't have a bilateral development cooperation framework, but there is never ever any hesitation to open up the embassies for a platform to talk about SRHR or women's rights or reproductive health and sexual health. So that's really good, and I think that we can continue working as we move forward. But the second part is, and I'm very thankful to SIDA that you're actually seconding a staff member to UNFPA in Bangkok to work at the regional level on health and human rights. Because I think that's exactly what we need to be able to understand better. How does the broader rights agenda, what impact does it have on sexual and reproductive health? And so I'm really very much looking forward to that contribution. And to Canada, I mean, I think it's basically the same thing. We work so well together with you at the country level. Yeah. And I just, if there's one message, just continue to keep, reaching out to us and keep us on our toes by all means as well. Because, at the end of the day, what we have to balance is, yes, the substantive part, the political dialogue around population development, the broader agenda, but we also have a very important task to make sure that the funding that we receive is well spent. And that's a responsibility to both Sweden and Canada to have that. So I can see that conversation going on. But what is so typical for both Canada and Sweden is that it's done in a very constructive and very positive tone. And it's never, there is always an understanding of should something go wrong and can we do different things? Because we're learning as we move forward as well. So thanks.
Heather, would you like to comment?
Sure. Well, thank you for that feedback. And in fact, you talk about us keeping you on your toes. One of the questions had been about self-reflection, about what we can do better. And in fact, it's having you keep us on our toes in terms of how we are implementing our programs and policies, I think is really important as well. And for us, that means actually shifting how we engage with and partner with civil society organizations. So it's not just about consulting and saying, you know, what do you think we should do? It's actually having you monitor what it is that we do and being open and providing a safe platform for criticism, direct criticism in terms of how we're operating. And in fact, we've implemented a monitoring mechanism in the context of our National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. And it's not always easy to hear some of the feedback, but on the other hand, it's necessary. So that was a point of self-reflection that I just wanted to make. But I think your point is well taken in terms of we need to just continue. We need to continue the focus and be mobilized, and you can't stop. You know, this has to continue, and we need to expand how we look at all the different elements. It's not just about women per se. We've got to keep working on this.
And in terms of supporting civil society organization and progressive faith-based actors, from your perspective, I mean, you've touched on that, all of you, that we are working together, but we must be more coherent perhaps and build even a stronger alliance. Is there something you see from your angle, from your perspective, that this is an area where I see we can really develop our cooperation?
So I am not the expert, and I mentioned
course,
this at the outset.
That.
And this is why it's so important where we've got organizations like you on the ground. You're the expert. This is why we need to be listening to what it is that you're doing. And it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. There's very much unique circumstances, and we, like the Swedish government, we open up our embassies, you know, in order to provide safe platforms for dialogue and to try to learn more. You had asked me to actually provide some feedback to our RFSU, and if I might actually do this, because I think this is something that would be really important. First off, what a great organization. So happy to read, you know, since the 1930s you've been there with your clear values and clear plans in terms of your goals. One area that when we've been talking to our civil society organizations who are on the ground in areas where the Mexico City policy, which is the policy implemented by the U.S. in withdrawing funding for abortions and any related services, and then any organizations that engage in that. We don't have enough information about what's going on. We don't actually understand the impacts directly, so it's difficult to assess what the needs are. And so in conversations with our civil society organizations, part of our action plan has been to try to specifically find out more. And I would say, RFSU, you've got a great network. If you can contribute to that, that will help ultimately define how it is that we can fill some of those gaps with the needs. Equally, offer up the Canadian embassies as a safe platform as well, together with Sweden, where conversations can happen, and maybe educate too about the Mexico City policy, some of the expansion, also the clarifications, because there may also be some misunderstanding about them, in which case those who are providing services, service delivery, abortions, etc., or other related services are pulling themselves out of the field, and now it's shrinking. And so, you know, how do we educate, pass the message about what it's all about, so they don't necessarily leave if there's a misunderstanding about it. So that was just my contribution.
Thank you so much, Heather. Time flies. Can you believe it? 43 minutes have passed already. It's incredible. But I will give the final word to Anna-Karin and to Victoria. 1 minute each, and then it's 1:45, and we just have to conclude.
Okay. I just want to say we'll be happy to do that. And we can become much stronger in that, I think. Like everyone else, we are trying to find our new role. how to act in this. And I want to point out how important it is to have the embassies, your embassies, as a safe place for these discussions in the different countries. I also want to point to one other thing that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, but now the time is very short, and that is how we work on the regional level. We have talked about the UN level, we have talked about the country level, and we have talked about the individual level. The regional level, we have a feeling, is becoming more and more important. To identify in regional levels who are the important actors, both those who are pushing us back and those we can
to have
work together
contextual
with.
strategies
Yes.
for in Africa, Latin America,
and
Europe.
I think this is something that we also can discuss much more.
Be developed. Victoria, you have the final concluding word, and then we just have
Big
to end.
responsibility on my shoulders.
Absolutely.
I wanted to jump off on your words and what you were saying about how civil society needs to keep you accountable to your policies, and I think it works both ways. I think we go and see funders and delegations, and we kind of expect them to understand what our projects are and these issues that we're working on are, but they're deeply complex. I mean, theology, religion. Often we expect people to understand what LGBTQI+ means, and I think we also need to work on our communications and explaining in accessible terms what we're doing and being transparent on that.
Thank you so much for sharing all your perspectives as different actors on this very, very important topic. And I can clearly see that there is this willingness to work together and to build even a stronger alliance. And we cannot take these issues for granted, as you said, Björn. The struggle will continue, and we really have to join forces from across the sector. So thank you so much for all your contributions. Time is up.
Okay. Great.